info in on what you appreciate about the podcast, maybe something you've changed your mind on. We'd just love to hear some feedback from your end. So this always being a one-way medium. So if you've got something you like, something you don't like, something you've changed your mind on, something you appreciate, any of the above, send it in. We've got 3 people, and I think we said we were going to do 3 gift cards. So far, they've got a 100% chance of winning one.
Wow, that's pretty good chances.
So if you want to ruin somebody's day and take their odds away,
That's right.
send in some feedback.
Wreck the odds.
Yeah.
And improve your own odds.
Yeah.
Because currently, outside of those 3, they have 0% chance
Exactly.
of winning. So get a question.
You miss
in.
100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky,
Wayne Gretzky.
Michael Scott.
Michael Scott.
There for all of our office watchers out there.
Yes, and I'm sure there's enough of them. So.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And more information just for your knowledge. Next week, after episode 300, for the remainder of the summer, we're going to every other week. So if you start missing it in your podcast feed, we are not slacking. We've chosen to go that way for a number of reasons. One is just scheduling with the summer. We can be missing people, but at this point for the summer, that's actually an even harder thing to keep the podcast going, because if you are connected to our church, Doug's on sabbatical for the next 2 months. So that means there are only 2 of us available. So one, we like having Doug around.
Yes,
we
do.
We don't want to do too many episodes without him being available for it. And 2, we just want to make sure that there's multiple voices on the podcast. And so for the sake of the summer, we're going to go to every other week until September. So you can kind of follow along knowing every other week. If you want to go back and listen to other episodes, feel free. But maybe just relax and enjoy the summer, not having to do the work of keeping up with podcasts.
I am really thankful for you to explain that to me, because I just thought we were taking 1 week off
Right.
throughout the summer every second week, because we had no ideas for episode 400 and we just wanted lots of leeway to get there and figure that out.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Maybe that's the third reason I didn't mention.
All right, good.
No, we love doing this podcast.
Yes, this is great. So do you want to jump into questions?
Yeah, because surprisingly, we have no AER with everything we handled the last couple weeks.
No way.
No AER, so let's jump into them.
All right, so question number 1. It says in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 21, it says, "For your sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." My question is this: how does Jesus become sin when we know that he is sinless? Is it imputation? Jesus took on our sin and in exchange gave us his righteousness, or is there more going on in this sentence?
Great question. So theologically, what this question really is getting at, if I'm reading it the way it was intended, is atonement theories. Really is what it's getting at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So atonement is how have we been made righteous, or how are we saved by the act of the cross, or I'm actually reading a book right now called something about different views on the atonement, which then includes Jesus' life and ministry, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension are all contributing factors to atonement, not just his death, which is often how we think of it.
Right.
And so there are a number I want to address that we fall into a danger, and every theological camp really does this, leaning too heavily into one illustration or picture within the New Testament more than another.
Yeah.
There are multiple, what's the right word? Multiple analogies used, but that's not even the right word. Multiple pictures that are painted within the New Testament to try to explain the greater mystery that is the atonement. And so the danger of pulling 1 or 2 verses out can overemphasize one part of what was done for us through Jesus' life and death and resurrection and ascension, that atones for our participation in this sinful and broken world. And so this question is highlighting one part of it that would generally, this verse, lean towards a penal substitutionary atonement
Right.
view, which is that we are sinful and we can't make right for all the sins we've done, so we needed somebody to take our place. Jesus did that by fulfilling a perfect life, and therefore he is the sacrifice that then makes our life right, which is generally the gospel most people today
I would say so.
have inherited.
Yep.
But it is a narrow part of the larger picture. I'm not going to say it's not right. I know some theologians go there. We were just talking about Brian Zahn. He's fundamentally against penal substitutionary atonement. I wouldn't put it high on the list of focuses. So what I will say here with this verse, and even the the question that has come in and the questioner's details. How has Jesus become sin? We know that he is sinless. Is it imputation? Jesus took on our sin in exchange, gave us his righteousness. Those are all parts of the picture. I will start with largely, I think, the picture that is painted here of Jesus being one outside the city. Hebrews goes out of the way to make specific detail of his crucifixion takes place outside. And this verse 2 is alluding to the two different goats that are offered on the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
And I think where we've often gone wrong with the gospel picture we've had that I've listed earlier, the penal substitutionary atonement one, is we take Jesus as the sacrificial offering that went into the temple, when that is not the one that actually carried the sin.
No, that's true.
Right? The sacrifice that carried the sin, according to the Levitical code, was the one that the priest put his hands on to carry the sin for all the people and was sent outside into the wilderness, that it would then carry their sin away from them. So Jesus having our sin is not necessarily what the picture was that was on the cross, but it was in fact the fact of him being outside the city. So he kind of brings these two pictures together in one gift. And so him taking on sin then on the cross is a little bit more towards the theory that I think takes a priority slot in the atonement of Christus Victor, which is Jesus defeating the powers of death through his act of dying and resurrecting, specifically highlighted to those two. So by living this life, he draws all the power of sin and the evil one could muster upon him in this moment, thinking they'd won all the powers, both human and not. The mixing of the two of how that all happens come together to try to defeat Jesus in this moment. And because of him taking on all the power of sin, maybe I could add that word, the power that sin would have behind it on the cross, putting all of its effort in to try to kill him, then he defeats it itself in all its power and therefore has undone it. And so Jesus takes on the power of sin, might be a clarifying word going along with the 2 Corinthians 5 passage. But at the same time, there is an element of this penal substitutionary atonement where I don't want to parse both out, but I think Paul's intentionally trying to bring both together in this picture. Yeah. And so I don't know of any reference quickly of a laying on of hands that happens from a priestly perspective for Jesus to have done that. But I believe he's acting as our priest by being both those gifts. So I've brought down a couple of pictures just in this one verse together, where he then offers on behalf of us this gift to God, and therefore defeating sin, but also atoning for our sin outside the city. So there's a lot. I'll shut up for a bit. I'll let you jump in.
Well, I appreciate your explanation because I think you did a really good job, Kyle. It always makes me think, as soon as you start down that trail and starting to flesh out the theology, is just what was Paul thinking, right? Because I don't know that his thoughts, and we don't have any of his writings to tell us that. Like, I don't know that he was a penal substitution guy. I don't know that he'd be a Christus Victor guy. Yeah. He definitely probably, we can assume, would not have either of those phrases, right? He might have an explanation as what he thinks happened through the cross and what God has revealed to him and all the rest. Yeah. But those theologies come out later when good, intentioned, smart guys sit down and go, what did Paul mean here, right? Totally. And then they start putting it together, and then they start bringing in the Old Testament, verses, and you come up with these atonement theories, and you're like, okay, this is the way it is. But like you said about theology, the more we dig into theology, usually the narrower and narrower and narrower we get, right? And then obviously we're people and we are flawed. Yeah. So most theologies, I would say all theologies that will hold up and say, this is the one, there's always a flaw to it, right? It's not God. Theology is not God. It's our thoughts about him, right? So interesting as you put those together and go, maybe Paul had a really clear understanding and just assumed that we got it, right?
Yeah, totally.
And maybe that's my own oversimplification of things. But sometimes when it comes to this kind of thing, I just go, I think he really believed that Jesus took his sin. Yeah. He was made righteous, sinless before God, and we're good. Yeah. Right? But you're right. There's the questioner is right. When we read it, it does make us think because we're like, well, hang on, because there's other passages where we're told Jesus is sinless. So how does this work? There's good theology out there, and it probably all comes up lacking to some degree in some ways sometimes,
Yeah.
right?
There are other theories too, and I wouldn't mind making quick mention of them
Yeah,
as well.
go for it.
That do play a part. I wouldn't say they're as tied to this passage, but just for the sake of the conversation. One would be the suffering servant is a really highlighted one that comes out of Isaiah 53.
Yeah.
And again, just it's fresh in my mind because I've been reading this book this week where the author really looks through Isaiah's passage, and the suffering servant operates according to Isaiah, and Jesus then sees himself as that person very clearly, I think, as when covenant has been broken and there is no way for the sacrificial system to make things right.
True.
That the suffering servant comes in and actually makes covenant re-available is
Right.
what the role of the suffering servant plays.
Yeah.
And so Jesus then, again, because of our sin and on behalf of our sin, there is broken relationship with God that we can't get back to. And so he then is acting as that suffering servant to reestablish covenant relationship. So then again, you might be able to put that in there on the language. If he became sin, like he took on the
Yeah.
brokenness because of our sinfulness. And the last one, which I've heard and read in multiple places now, would probably be the most common or like first to mind in the early church, would be ransom theory, which isn't substitutionary atonement of like, but somebody needed to be taken by sin, and it really kind of bleeds into the other ones.
Yeah.
So penal substitutionary atonement, where I would divide the two, this is getting really into the weeds. Penal substitution is God had to have vengeance for the sin that was done in order to make things right.
Right.
Ransom theory would lean more towards sin has power and it needs to be appeased, not God.
Right.
And so Jesus then taking on our sin to pay its price is paying the ransom on our behalf to the powers of sin that we've given it and we've given over to it, which N.T. Wright's work would be really reminiscent of that, in exchange for us to be free.
Yeah.
So he's paying the ransom to sin, not to God, which is where penal substitutionary atonement focuses.
Yeah.
I'll leave all those on the table.
No, and I love it. And again, thank you for clarifying those things, because that is exactly what it is, right? And that should be how theology continues to work for as long as, God gives us life and as long as this world exists, is always trying to figure it out, right?
Totally.
We're encouraged biblically to try and figure those things out.
Yeah.
And when we read a theology and we see that it comes up short, and not everybody would have a problem with penal substitution pinning it on God necessarily, that God's vengeance needs to be, appeased.
Yep.
But some people would, and they're like, okay, so how do we figure it out? Well, then ransom theory helps that, because like, okay, same thing, but now we're appeasing the sin, right? And the power of sin rather than God. So I appreciate theologians. I appreciate you, Kyle, because you know so much. I appreciate my brother who writes papers and tries to figure all this stuff out. I appreciate these people because I'm not that guy.
Right.
So I can listen to the podcast and go, okay, maybe there's some theories here.
Yeah.
Maybe I can kind of figure that out. But I think just being open-handed enough to understand that obviously God did something to free us from sin through Jesus. And we can be, assured of that, right? We can be assured of our salvation and all those things. Yeah. But then, for those of us that like to think and figure it out, we can ask questions and we can dig into, right? So,
and that's our hope, that people would enjoy that, and that inspires and draws us closer to God. I know there's personalities out there that go, this is all just annoying. I can't do this. Doesn't help my faith. That I go, all you need to know is Jesus loves you and has made us right.
Then just stay there and you're good,
right? That if this isn't of leaving, for me, it leaves me in awe and wants me to pull deeper into God and the mysteries of it. And that's the other thing I constantly have to remind myself is there's some things that are always going to remain mystery. I can get deeper into them, but I'll never solve the mystery. Right. To get too focused on one mechanism or another of how God did perform atonement, that we can lose then the concept of mystery that is supposed to be there.
Yeah.
That those of us that want to spend more time in our head, like myself, and probably to a fault, need to be cautious of, and those that it's not, don't bother getting into the weeds with us and fast forward the podcast.
But I love the podcast, and I love it for that reason. And I would think even, with us fishing for the 300th episode and what has changed for you, I appreciate, often it always, I don't like change, and I don't like thinking that maybe I don't know properly. So when, you, Kyle, or anybody else, brings up a new theology or maybe an old theology that I just haven't heard before, I'm always like, that's not right. But then it makes me have to wrestle with it, right? And so maybe, maybe a listener right now today is listening to this and going, penal substitution, been taught that my whole life, totally good with it.
Yep.
But what does it mean? Then
Yep.
are we appeasing God's vengeance? Because that is a weird thought
Yep.
for some people, right?
Yep.
And maybe that is something where you're like, okay, so what are other theories? How does this work?
Yeah.
If I don't like that outcome,
Yeah.
how can I see my sin being absolved? How can I see Christ doing the work for me without having to appease,
Yeah.
God's vengeance, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe you're okay with that and then you want to dig into that more. But
Yeah.
hopefully the podcast keeps making you think and keeps raising questions that just, help you, like you said, Kyle, grow deeper in your relationship with Christ.
Right.
Not cut the legs from underneath it. I think that's the wrong idea.
Yeah.
But make us go, wow, God's so big
Yep.
and just so awesome, right?
Yeah, totally.
So, we love your questions.
Yeah.
Thank you for sending them in. And thank you for clarifying really well. So,
It's literally what I'm here for.
all right, let's jump on to the next question then. What steps should both churches and Christians as individuals take to make reparations for the historical and current injustices against Indigenous communities?
I'm just readily intimidated by this question. And I think that's part of the issue is we don't know where to begin as churches. And that can lead to what I would see is one of two defaults that I see happening around is one, just an apathy of going, well, I don't know. So, and where do we even begin? So why try? Or two, and this is less frequent, I can see a quick defensiveness of, I think it's a tactic to just respond. I don't even know how to deal with the weight of this. That wasn't our issue when we weren't alive when that happened. That we can sometimes default that way.
Yeah.
I think that this got some theological implications too of seeing ourselves as individuals more than as communities that we shouldn't. Anyways, I won't get into all that. I think first, to be honest, for individuals as churches, the place where we have to begin is twofold. One, coming to a place of acknowledgement and confession. Mm-hmm. And two, just beginning to learn, because you can only do as much as you are aware of.
Yep.
And then with that, all through a lens of grace. Mm-hmm. Because I think sometimes we can either weigh under a weight of guilt of I can't do enough, and the fact that we're trying, I think, is honoring to God and to the people that have been so harmed.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I think as we try to get better, this is becoming more and more common. I feel like in today's culture. Is we're so afraid of doing the wrong thing that we just don't even bother to begin. As you go to learn, be prepared to continuously be unlearning and relearning. And as you continue to try to speak and communicate how to see things change for the better, again, your ideas at first on any subject, this goes for that, are going to be really naive at first and mature and become more realistic over time. So just beginning the journey and slowly is I want to commend that to begin. And I say that not just to those that might be listening or watching, but to myself too. There are a lot of books that I have on my shelf, a couple of them that I've cracked, but I haven't even gotten into fully to begin to understand this subject and how deeply we need to make repair and to understand and to lament over this in our current Christian culture. Specifics on how to make reparations, I don't even think I can begin to speak to that, as much as just trying to understand and B, contextually trying to make space for. Like to be honest, looking at churches that I grew up in Ontario, we didn't have a lot of Indigenous population in our area, which means it's really hard to do something outside of context.
Yeah.
Here in Alberta, there's a lot more proximity to reserves and Indigenous communities. That I think we have a lot more onus, to be honest, practically here in Alberta than we would in Ontario in the context that I grew up in. And so they've got to be context specific, but they've got to be prayerfully considered and amongst a community and with Indigenous peoples involved. I will quickly say that too as one more thing. Often we can, I'll just say it. As white people, we can often try to fix problems without considering those that we're trying to help, and do a really poor job. And that's speaking from a really ignorant and uneducated guy in this subject. So I'd love to pass. And I know you've got a lot more connection. Blake, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the easy answer, but as well, it can be total cop-out, like you're saying, is just love, right? Like we need to be loving. But then just to say, well, I love them, so it's all good. Well, no, that's like, how does your love play out, right? I love the education piece that you're talking about, Kyle. I think of slightly different, but obviously there's Indigenous people on the street. So I'll just share a story about my deal with homelessness. I worked downtown Calgary, right, pretty much out of high school anyways, and passed homeless people on the street all the time and never even gave them a second look because I didn't know what to do, right? And that was it. Then I went on a mission trip to Seattle where we hung out with homeless people and got to speak to them. So I was like, oh, you can talk to these people, right? And came home and started doing that.
Right.
And the more educated I got about homelessness, the more effective I felt in being able to just see them, first of all, like look at them in the eye and acknowledge them as people, right? But I think the education helps with that. So then, fast forward to now the Indigenous stuff, same thing. Like, if you care, if you hear these words, if you see these things on the news, if you see these things on social media, if you realize that our world is changing and we're realizing, whoa, maybe we weren't so good with these people, then what did we do, right? You mentioned that you have a couple books. My wife is actually Métis, so she cares hugely about this. She's got lots of books and it's made me read more than I probably wanted to tell you the truth. But one of the simplest ones was just 21 things you didn't know about the Indigenous Act. So starting back, late 1800s and currently things that are still law in Canada that play a part in our Indigenous communities. And there's way more than 21 things you should know, but the 21 are kind of the big highlights. So you're just like, oh, I did not know that. And it helps you understand how we got to the place we're at. Now, how do we make reparations? Like that is hopefully a lot smarter people than me are trying to figure that out because it is a massive issue that started wrongly or rightly. Christianity is involved. We had missionaries doing great things. We had missionaries doing really terrible things. We had all sorts of stuff. How do we make reparations? I don't know. Like, and most of you that are listening know that like throwing money at these people or throwing money at any situation that's wrong probably doesn't solve a lot.
I was going to say something.
It probably takes a lot of personal care and intention. I would say knowing some missionaries. In fact, we fund a guy on the West Coast that does Indigenous work. Like it's all relationship with these people. You can't just show up and be like, hey, high five and let me fix something for you and walk away. Their whole culture has been built for hundreds of years on relational stuff. So if you want to make reparations and feel like you're doing part of that, you need to make relationships. And they're people. So love them and care for them as people, right? Like it's, and again, that's such a small answer to such a big thing, but I think our churches should care. I know some really awesome stories of churches, like you said, Kyle, that are much more immersed in the community, right? Where they have Indigenous people just all around them that do fantastic work with Indigenous people.
Totally.
I know a lot of churches that just don't have any ties to that, so it's probably not even on their radar, right? So how do we love them? How do we make the right steps? I think, as we've said many times on this podcast about different groups and different allegiances to people and different divides and lines we draw, we got to love people. That's the biggest thing.
Which to speak to that, like, not at all pulling back or saying this is not an important issue, but there are only so many issues any one church or individual can care for and feel a call and a drawing towards, right? That, again, context specific. Thinking of Airdrie. Not to say that we can't care about this issue and that we shouldn't, but to speak of all the issues that are surrounding our community, including this one, and we're one of the highest rates of domestic violence in our province, let alone in Canada, in this city, at least last I heard statistically. Like there are a huge amount of teen drug use within suburban cultures. Like there are so many things, and if we begin talking to the weight that each of these seemingly, when you stop to think about them, need, we can't do it. And so that's where I lean into the hope of the capital C church. Like to celebrate those stories. And that's one thing I'm trying to do more in my own life is celebrate stories of God's goodness and where his church is moving without always feeling the weight that I can be involved in every problem or we as a church can be involved in every problem. But just to say that, like, there are many really important issues that no one church community or individual can solve. So let's just pray and believe that the Spirit of God who raised Jesus from the dead is the one at work and leading his church in Canada's culture and globally, but Canada's culture and the things that we need to do and leading in the so we have to again prayerfully consider what ones we can be involved in and how to do that tactfully, with wisdom and patiently to see those changes happen. But yeah,
and I think to speak to that, Kyle, we are trying to do that as a church, and I love it and I respect it and I love being part of our community.
Yeah.
I remember years ago we had I attended a church that went through a pretty drastic church split. And at one of the meetings, where people are trying to fix this up, one guy got up and pretty passionately talked about, soldiers. I don't know how true it was or where he got the story from, but, soldiers, when they have a task or, a war or whatever it is, they go out and they do diligence and they work together great.
Yeah.
But when they have nothing to do, they come back to the barracks and they all infight and fight each other, right? And I just, and he was saying that. He's like, if our church had mission, maybe we wouldn't be all sitting here fighting over, whatever issues.
Right.
But I think of that even just with our podcast, with the questions we get, with things we deal with, on a daily life in church life and as individuals, as Christians trying to follow Jesus well. I do believe that. I think it's so true. If we have mission, we usually work together really good. Yeah. And maybe we don't need to, get so high and talk philosophically and come up with all these divides and reasons why we hate each other. Yeah. Find what your mission is. If you live in an Indigenous community, figure it out, right?
Totally.
I think, there's so much that churches can do, or like you said, Kyle, there's just a multitude of issues that we can show as Christian people and as churches that we love people that we need to be doing. And that is the purpose of the church, right? So, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Ready for the next question?
I guess so.
All right. Next one's short, but interesting. Would Living Springs be open to hosting family-friendly drag events?
I appreciate this. And to be honest, I thought something might come along after some of the questions we've been wrestling with the last couple weeks. To cut no corners, I don't think it fits with everything we're aiming to do right now. Not to say, again, I'm not sure what conversation you and Doug had. I didn't get to watch the full of the episode. But then last week when we went back to some of that AER, thankful for some awareness of the background towards the readings and all that, the family stuff, the differentiating between the two styles of events. But I just don't feel like at this point our church hosting one would be of enough fruit without of value without cost, and pushing away. That there's a patience in what we're doing. And I feel like we are having some conversations that not every church that I've been able to witness is willing to have, because we've offended people in this podcast.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we want to, as we go somewhere, take people with us and also not rush into things.
Yeah.
That I look at an event like this, and to be honest, I think we're trying to make space and hold conversation that are slowly shifting in both directions those people that we're having conversation with, and I think we're doing that fruitfully. Yeah. To jump into an event like that, I don't believe would do that. It may lean so one-sidedly. It would offend a lot more people than it would help them change and shift and become open. That I don't, and I don't even know personally if that's where I'm at. I don't think that's where I'm at as a individual. Not speaking for our church. I'm happy to have these conversations in other ways, and I feel like they're more fruitful and all that. So I can't speak for our church, but that's my initial reaction.
Yeah, I'd agree. It feels if all of a sudden you came to me tomorrow, Kyle, and said, "Hey, want to do this. Let's announce it."
Yeah,
it feels like way ahead of where we are on this issue, specifically, or these kind of issues. Yeah. And not to say that we can't be pushing things so that we show love to our community and all these things.
Yep.
But I think we've done a good job at walking with our church and our people at a pace that they can appreciate, and a pace that is brought on by just the pressures even of our congregation. Like when people come in our building and they want to be part of our community, then we spread our wings and go, okay, how do we fit them in, right? And that is with every person, right? Going back to our last question, if all of a sudden we had Indigenous people that started coming to our church that were like, we want to be part of this community, we would spread our wings and we would figure out how to do that.
Totally.
Right? So I'd say the same thing with this. Yeah, it's something not even on our radar at the moment.
Yeah.
But I would feel like if the right ways were talked about, and I didn't listen to you and Doug last week, but I know what Doug and I talked about, the week before or whatever.
Yeah.
I think if it was presented to us, I think if it was something where we had a community of people that needed this, if it was going to, make our community better at loving God and loving people,
Right.
then we would probably proceed.
Right.
But at the moment, we're not there. It is way far ahead of where we are. And I think you could probably even hear this in the podcast by the response that Doug and I had in the first question.
Sure.
We're super uneducated on any of these things, right? So, yeah, obviously, we're going to put our efforts behind things that we care about and we know about and we're doing, right? And obviously where God is leading. Obviously, I don't know if that's obvious. I want to say that. We're not doing anything as a church or pastors or a staff without praying into it and being led by God into the areas that we should be led into, right?
Yeah.
So all those factors would play into this.
Yeah. I alluded to last week, and hopefully I fleshed it out clearly enough. Like, again, just representing my own personal stance, not speaking for anybody else on the podcast or our church by any means. I'm not sure if drag at all is necessarily the way to introduce this conversation for kids. That to say family friendly. I'm not saying that and again, last week on the podcast, I tried to address, I think there are really valuable things that are being aimed for in the form of protest that drag is, of trying to make space for queer kids who struggle and the suicide rates amongst them. Clearly what we're doing in society has not been helpful.
Yep.
So to make space for individual kids, especially, who are struggling with that at their own pace. But I feel like some of the methods that are being used right now are being so widely applied. They're bringing kids into the conversation that's not on their radar yet, that a family-friendly drag event, in my view, may not be a universally applicable tool. And so to start conversations around gender identity and sexuality far too young before a kid's ready for it or is not struggling with it, I don't think is always helpful. And so again, to host that where I think there are spaces where that would actually be rushing somebody into a conversation that they're not yet ready for is not necessarily accomplishing what I think it sets to do, though it is trying to see those few kids that are really struggling and clearly don't have space within society. So I just don't know how to help those kids best and educate adults to see those kids and help them best without also bringing others in who are not yet ready for that conversation. That I just, again, personally don't know if family-friendly drag events are necessarily able to accomplish what their aim is.
Yeah, and we've probably talked about this before on the podcast, but there's so many layers to doing church and to being a pastor and leading well.
Yep.
I remember a question that seemed way too black and white to me way back years ago when I was first in person, or do you care for the whole congregation?
Yeah.
And I was like, great question. I don't know the answer, right? Like, do we, because we need to care for the whole congregation. We need to care for all our people. We need to bring people along and educate them and love them and care for them and direct them and have personal relationships with them all at once, but all intermingled at the same time, right? Yep. So like you're saying, there's so many pieces of this complex puzzle. Yep. And I would pray and hope that as church staff and pastors and all the rest, that we would be listening to God. And like I said before, we would be loving God and loving people and doing it well.
Yep.
Fully realizing that we are going to offend people all the time.
Yeah.
And because somebody is always going to disagree with the stance or the position or even the direction we go. Yep. And that could be simple things that aren't even big issues. I mean, there's crazy things that have happened in churches, such as, church divides over replacing carpet. Yep. Right? Like this isn't anything
growing
to
up
do
with
with
painting
people,
beige.
right? Yeah. You paint the building the wrong color and people are leaving, right?
Yep.
So we just know that people have opinions. They matter. They care. Most people, I'm going to believe, have good intentions. Some people are just purely evil and bent on taking you down. But either or, you're just going to have people that are not on the same page as you. So every time we present something, and especially now bringing something that is a way bigger issue in society, we have to tread lightly, but we need to be really wise. Doug's not here, but he's the wisest guy I know. So I love being on his team because I think he leads us well in that, right?
Yeah.
So
totally.
Yeah.
I was at one point proposed a hypothetical scenario. can't even remember what the details were. And I stopped to answer it to say, well, do you want my pastoral answer or my theological answer?
Right.
And they were kind of frustrated that I would divide it in such a way. Mm-hmm. But for conversation as divisive, but yet so wrapped up in people's identity, you want to be careful. And so I said, theologically, right now, my interpretation is this. This is where I land. Mm-hmm. But then the individual comes to me and asks me, okay, so what is it? I'm not going to come at them guns ablaze and get to my theological position now. That's not how Jesus, who has come, and God, who sent his son for us, spent 1,000 years, if at the very least, working with Israel to bring his son to then spend the next 2,000 trying to win our hearts over as well through the gift of his son. Yeah. Many generations have come and gone in this patient process that then we as followers of God quickly go, well, we better fix it right now. That is not the way. So theologically, we can actually absolutely have a position. Yeah. And I think we've alluded to that even as individuals right now within this conversation. But at the same time, the way we execute that, hopefully, and walk that out looks a lot more like the God that we serve in the patience of it than necessarily getting people to where we want. And so there's patience.
Yeah. And yeah, I totally agree with that. And I appreciate it, Colin, that yes, my first reaction to most things is probably not godly.
Right. Same.
Right? I'm trying to get there, and hopefully God is working on me. And, hopefully there is situations where my first reaction is godly because I am slowly learning God's will. I was sharing with you, I was up at 2 o'clock yesterday morning reading a book about God's will and going, yeah, God, I hear you, right? That my will does not align with God's very often. Yeah. I am selfish, and I am human, and all the rest. Yeah. And I am sinful. Yeah. And so, yes, to go, okay, this is my first reaction. Now to think about it a little more, to go, okay, what is God leading us in? How do we get this? And hopefully, like you say, the end result looks a lot more like God than it does Blake. Yeah, right?
Totally.
So I like that.
Well, I like the language of pastoral versus theological. Theological is black and white. This is what we've exegeted from the scripture. Mm-hmm. The definition of pastor is shepherd. Yeah. And so to get my sheep there because I know where the water is and I need to get them there is not often an A to B, quickly, immediate teleportation, just to bring up some more controversial things on the podcast, method of getting them there. But there's meanderings and physical obstacles and personalities and sheep wandering off to get to that place that we need to account for as for us as pastors, lead our group of people towards where we want to get to. And there's a patience in that. And we're not going to do it perfectly. We are not claiming at all that that's how we lead and that we've got it all figured out. But there's a process to get places. So we appreciate the patience that people keep coming back, sending an AER, willing to have these conversations with us. Maybe there's some people who we've offended in one direction or another that aren't willing to continue to listen. But I hope you see our heart, our care for people, and also our love for our Savior and for Scripture, that we're trying to walk this out well with as many people on board as possible, walking them along with us. So,
yeah, awesome. Yeah. All right, let's jump to the next one. Oh, sorry, I was going to skip over a question, but I'll get back to it. It says, as Christians, is it acceptable to participate in religious ceremonies of other beliefs? Does this violate the first commandment?
This is an awesome question.
That's a good question.
So quickly, I think of it. Maybe this is a poor spot to start. I think it's 2 Kings. Is it Naaman who wants to take soil home from Israel? Yeah. Is that right? Okay,
I think that's right.
Where this man comes and sees that Israel's God is strong and is better than his home gods, and he's a servant to one of the other kings somewhere else in another land. And he's come to realize that I'm really vaguely remember the details of the story. It's a miracle that happens in his life.
Yeah, he has leprosy.
And he's healed. Yeah. So he realizes that Yahweh, this God of Israel, is worthy to be served. And at the same time, he knows he needs to go home to serve the king that he works for, and that he needs to then be involved in the temple processes of his nation that he was there for. And so he asks if he can take soil from Israel, and if God would forgive him while being in the temple of this other God, to be standing on the little bit of soil to represent, I'm actually in my head worshiping Yahweh, if that would be forgiven. And he's absolutely given that grace. Yeah. And so that story quickly first comes to mind to say, within the Bible, there is space for God to recognize our heart more than our practice. At the same time, that can then be pulled towards this universalism end of things of, well, it's totally okay and it's all right. And so we can go, I can totally participate in XYZ religious practice and God's going to have grace for me. And quickly our heart goes along with that. That as many things on this podcast, there is a tension to be walked out. And so, yes, some of us may need the reminder of first commandment. Second, to also say we can often assume culture into Christianity at its purest. I don't know how to say that any more delicately than that. Sometimes we can assume Western practices are and equate them to Christian, but that is not the case. There are certain Western aspects and expressions of Christianity that then we say this must be it. That there are things that happen, I'm sure, in the Church of Asia, of South America, of Africa, which South American church, like the average Christian would be a South American woman at this point. That is where the largest population of Christianity is, and the largest population of Christianity amongst genders is female. So there are certain things that people would be doing to express their Christianity in different cultures that would be foreign and offensive to some of us in the West, that we would then maybe call religious in other spots. So I want to just layer the levels of nuance that are here. And this is nothing new to Christianity. This is from the very beginning of the gospel of Paul and the apostles trying to wrestle out, how do we do this for the pagans as well as for the Jews? And you guys are being too Jewish, you're leaning way too much into that, or telling other people they're being too. And this guy over here is eating meat off idols, and that's not a big deal. But if it's a big deal, you got to stop. Like, there's a clear level of conviction and drawing of the Holy Spirit that goes beyond ruling.
Yeah.
And so I want to say there is space for people to participate. Now, to narrow in a little bit, if that religious ceremony of another belief is specifically to honor another God, I would have a hard time seeing how that can be walked out over the long haul. Mm-hmm. I've seen and heard of stories of Christians getting to pray with other Muslims and being able to celebrate that, and that's good. But to go to mosque every week I go to mosque on Saturday and I go to church on Sunday, I think at some point your heart's going to be divided.
Yeah.
So I would give caution to long-term expression and maybe considering there might be ways to celebrate and honor a culture and even the good things of religion without necessarily participating and pointing towards worship of another God, and so consideration. But I think largely, and I know sometimes this podcast could probably be frustrating to people, and even in some of our AR. I know you guys skirt things with language. It's not what I'm trying to do. But I think right within our Bible, there's a tension recognized that cannot be solved, that comes more down to the individual heart than being able to point to certain laws one way or another.
Yeah. Yeah, I think historically, there is obvious evidence for correction, right? Where people of faith, people of Christianity have gone, it's not okay to mix religions. Yep. Like, you guys are, playing this game where, Yahweh is not the only God you serve and honor.
Yeah.
And that needs to be changed, right? And I would fully agree that I think that needs to be changed because you said your heart divided is not right? Where, your treasure is there, your heart will be also, right? So we need to follow that. But then I think of the flip side of that, when my brother and I were young adults, we had some Mormon missionaries show up at our door, and we invited them in because we thought it'd be awesome, and we started this relationship with these guys. And we were told by a few of the people that we respected in our church, don't do that. Like, you just don't talk to any other religion because they might trick you or, deceive you or, convert you, right?
Totally.
And I remember thinking, well, what? Like, why are we so scared of everybody, right? So we didn't follow that advice, and we continued on. And I learned a whole bunch about Mormons, and it actually strengthened my faith. Now, that's for me.
Yep.
I could see how somebody else might have fallen into that trap, and I know of Christians that have converted to Mormonism because they've been loved on and helped well, right? Yeah. So again, to lay down in black and white, this is how it's going to be for all people, just doesn't work, right? It's always a matter of, each person and figuring out where they are and the wisdom they follow. I love that you went to Nahum or whatever his name was, because that's such a good place of recognizing that God has such patience and grace for us,
Totally.
And that he's
Is
not,
that ideal? Would we have prescribed that? No,
but he's not chucking lightning bolts at anybody who gets a little bit off track.
Totally.
He's got grace for people, right?
Yeah.
and then in Romans, I just flipped to Romans 15. I won't read it to you, but the beginning of it, you can read through Romans 15 yourself. Just talks about, strong and weak, right? Yeah. And not that it's demeaning to anybody. It's just saying some people can't mess around with stuff that's ungodly because they're going to get tempted and they're going to fall to it. Yeah. Others have no issue with some things, right? Yeah. So you got to kind of pick your battles on this one. I would say, if this is happening in your life specifically, now going to the person who's asking this question, I always ask the question, why? Like, why do you need to be a part of this religious ceremony? Like, is it family? Is it friends? Is it you're being invited into it? And it would be a great way of just showing love to people to attend this and be part of it. Right. Are you wanting to be part of it because you're curious? Well, that's a different thing altogether, right? So yeah, figuring out why you would put yourself in that situation, and then being honest with yourself, doing the reflection thinking, as we ask you to do on this podcast often. Are you strong enough to be in this situation? Read Romans 15 for yourself and go, which guy am I? Am I the strong guy or am I the weak guy, right? Yeah. What are you trying to accomplish by being there? All these things are good questions to kind of think about before you enter into it, right? Totally. Because I think when you start doing that and you think about the justification maybe that you're doing to yourself, or you think of the friends that you're trying to win to Christ or whatever it is, you'll find your answer. Yep. And you'll also probably figure out where your temptation is going to come and where you could be in trouble. Yep. And then if you've done the homework and you're kind of, pre-thought these ideas, you can either avoid the situations that are going to be trouble for you, or you can find someone that can be with you who is strong, and you can walk in these things. I think there's probably many situations where you could participate in a religious ceremony and it could be a really good thing. Yeah. I can also think of a lot of situations where you could be participating in a religious ceremony and be really in trouble. Yeah.
And it's a difficult one to toe the lines, just to really muddy the waters some more. Like, a lot of our Christian dates of celebrations of things were once pagan holidays.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? And there are Christians who go so far as, well, we got to stop celebrating Easter and we got to stop celebrating Christmas because those were once pagan holidays, so we can't touch them. And even, to be honest, within Christianity, there's people, we can't do that, that's too Catholic.
Right. Absolutely.
What? There are infinite ways to lose yourself through this conversation and forget the whole focus of it. Is, are we giving ourselves and worshiping the God that we serve? Yeah. And getting too focused that way. And then again, you can easily get too loose. But again, just to keep bringing it back to our Bible to show this has been a constant story. Peter at one point is trying to not eat with Gentiles, just eating with them. He considered too much of a religious crossing, that he wasn't willing to do that. And Paul just calls him on it. Stop being a hypocrite. Yeah. Right? That there has been this tension to try to honor God to the best of our abilities. And that is noble. And I want to give that commendation, and I want to also say I would love to see more grace and patience in this. Mm-hmm. That inviting of conversation, of challenging through relationship to call a brother or sister, say, hey, why? I really like that you pointing that out. Why are you participating in this, or why are you not being willing, and having really good conversation around it. I know we've talked about Halloween a couple times on the podcast. Totally. At the last Donuts in Discussion, two people got having a conversation about that around the topic of center church. Let's not get too black and white too quick, and then call one another higher from wherever we stand.
Yeah, I like it.
All right,
moving on.
Wow, we're flying. So I'm going to put one more plug. We need questions, because if Blake and I keep going at this rate, we're going to be out of questions by 3 weeks.
Doug that slows us down.
It must be.
He talks a lot, that guy.
And he's not even here to defend himself.
No,
I agree. I'll agree for that sake.
All right.
Yeah.
He'll probably call us heretics. We'll get a message somewhere.
Sorry, I don't take calls of heretics from Marcy Nights.
All right. This is kind of an opinion and then a question tacked on the end, but here it is. I am a totally affirming person, if anyone cares, but I feel this podcast has become all gay all the time. Yes, I know there are nuances from different terms. However, I wouldn't be surprised if in the past year, almost half the time on the podcast has been about LGBTQ issues. I was happy it was addressed. I think we know where the three pastors land on the issues. Will there be a moment where you recommend this discussion be taken offline so the issues can be resolved, or at least discussed privately to the party's satisfaction?
Great question. We, I think, regularly try to invite conversation outside of the podcast.
Yes.
That we have offered. One, some of these things are sensitive and people aren't able to and aren't willing to have that conversation in person. So they prefer this medium, whether for right or for wrong or for most fruitful way or not. Sometimes that's not available. Two, I don't think we're ever going to start ignoring any questions because we've made the commitment to not.
Yep.
In my 6 years on this podcast, since day one, we have had seasons of LGBTQ questions coming in and out, in flux. And just thinking about it, practically speaking, what I think that means is we have new people coming on who are curious where we as individuals and as a church stand on this subject.
Yep.
Because I cannot imagine somebody going, you know what? I'd love to rehear after I've been listening to this podcast for a while where those guys stand.
Yeah.
So yes, we could easily just make a catalog of here are the issues where you can go back and talk about it and point people that way. But I don't think we're going to ignore the questions and point people to other resources. But two, I hope that there is space for us to continue to grow and learn. So I've heard as well, just noting, I can speak to Doug more than I can speak to yourself, Blake. I've noticed Doug's language change. Just as I've had more opportunity to learn things, I think my language has shifted to using the term gay instead of homosexual. That's one thing that I noticed Doug's language has shifted in to realize, okay, he came to see that language was probably more beneficial and more culturally aware. So to point somebody to a question from 2 years ago, when he was still not there, and I'm not trying to pick on you, Doug, if you're listening, I would love to celebrate instead of having the conversation again to see he's growing.
Yeah.
And I hope the same could be said about me. I can speak externally, I can watch him. I don't know where I can't speak to myself, that I hope my language, my heart are shifting and growing and want to leave it open for my opinion to change and where I land theologically. That I think there's benefit for this conversation to come up multiple times. I give you full permission as a listener. If you see the subject in the question, we try to do our best to make sure all the questions are listed in the description. Jump it. If you don't need to hear us again, if you feel really settled in your heart, great. At the same time, I hope the same for you, that as we keep chatting, sounds like you've landed in a totally affirming position. Maybe the things we can challenge you on that. That to have this conversation, if you consider it important enough to be involved in and people in your life around you, maybe hearing it is going to be challenging. So feel free to skip, but maybe the challenge to keep listening. So I don't think we're going to table them. I think it's worth continuing to have. But we do love in-person conversations, probably even more so than this medium.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I don't have anything to add to that, Kyle. That is well said.
Thanks.
Do you want to go on to the next question, or should we?
Well, we saved some because at this pace, we'll make it a short podcast this week.
Yeah, I was going to say we're not too short. We're only 7 minutes shorter than we could be, but yes, I think we can wrap up. You guys, we'll save some of these questions for next week. They're good ones. Keep sending them in. We love answering them. Next week is 300, so let us know.
Send in your feedback.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe your language has changed around LGBTQ issues, so maybe that's a good one too. So send us in your feedback. We would love to hear it. We want to celebrate next week. We will talk to you then.
See you, everyone.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com.